So let's talk about one of the big danger units from Codex Emperor's Children. The Flawless Blades are enhanced by demonic mutations to cut down the enemy's champions and leaders. So let's talk about what these Pinnacles of the Legion can do in game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Emperor's Children once more, and in this video I thought we'd do an overview for the Flawless Blades and their rules from the new Codex, first talking about their lore and the models, going through all the rules for their datasheet, and a few options for combos and synergies that they have in the Codex, and just how much damage they can do. Lore-wise, they're a recent creation, being a new unit for Warhammer 40k Emperor's Children, though they're trying to be the dark mirrors of the Palatine Blades from the Horus Heresy, descended into outright depravity like the rest of the Legion, though taking no less pride in their craft, being some of the foremost blade masters in the galaxy, the shock elite of the Legion, and well versed in dispatching enemies, heroes and elites with their blades, all well enhanced with combat stims and certain demonic gifts and mutations that give them unnatural swiftness. They're near enough to being the chaos-possessed equivalent for Emperor's Children, though rather than having full-on out-and-out demonic possession, they instead have more a whole bunch of demonic boons and mutations, their flesh warped to Slaanesh's designs, so massively enhanced Space Marines, but too prideful to share their perfect forms with a demon apparently. The models themselves are all very twisted, mutated Slaaneshi duelists, seemingly wanted to show off some of their demonic mutations and sculpted abs apparently, and also going for the sort of one-half breastplates that Slaanesh seems to be so fond of. The models are armed with bliss blades, and I believe they have a couple of different ways to assemble each of them, though all the actual options are aesthetic ones given that they don't have any war gear choices in the Codex. The options are more about poses and head swaps. They're going to be boxed in units of 3s, the likely price of them should be £40, $62 or €51, the same as the Inner Circle Companions or the 8-bound for the World Eaters. As their points go, they look fairly middling points per dollar as far as Games Workshop goes, so not awful on that front seeing as they seem quite elite, but compared with some kits not really very much plastic for the amount of money that you pay. These 3 model box sets often tend to be particularly bad on that particular metric. If you want to pick them up as well, bear in mind they'd also be in the Combat Patrol box set as well, 2 sets of 3 of them there, so I feel like once the Slaaneshi range is all out, that's going to be a popular way to pick them up, maybe more so than individually boxed in sets of 3. Lore and models aside though, let's get into their rules in Codex Emperor's Children, and have a stat line that's maybe not so very different from things like Chaos Space Marine Possessed or World Eaters 8-bound. They move 8 inches, a toughness 5 with 3 wounds and a 3+ save, and a sort of demonic 5+ invulnerable, and a leadership 6 with OC 1. They basically move a bit faster than standard Emperor's Children or Chaos Space Marines in general, and are a good chunk tougher than your average Space Marines with 3 wounds and the toughness 5 and the invulnerable. They're available in units of 3 to 6. Their printed points cost is 130 points per 3 of them, though obviously that might change. At first impressions that seems like an okay price tag for them. Certainly paying a big premium, but they do have some nice advantages like some very general purpose damage output. For keywords they have all the ones that you'd expect, they aren't demons, and the only notable one is that they have grenades, so could throw some mortal wounds about as they charge in potentially, though I guess quite a lot of the time with thrill seekers they might be advancing and stop themselves doing that. For their weapons, their profile is fairly simple, they don't get any options as mentioned, and all of them are armed with bliss blades. They're pretty accurate and fairly punchy, 3 attacks at weapon skill 2+, at strength 6, AP -3 and damage 2. Basically a very good anti-Space Marine profile in that. It should be very nice at cutting down things like Chaos Legionaries or enemy intercessors. The AP means they're generally going to be better against things with high saves, but less good against things with high and vulnerable saves, and despite hitting accurately they don't have a huge amount of attacks, and they don't have a sweep mode either, so aren't going to be quite as effective against things like enemy hordes of 1 wound infantry. The profiles definitely want to take hand in hand with their special rule though, which is demonic patrons. When they're about to fight in the fight phase, they can choose to call upon their patrons when they're selected. They don't have to, but if they do, they basically get a very nasty damage boost, but at the risk of losing a model if you don't kill anything. If you call upon the patrons, then all their attacks will always critical wound on a 3+, and that means that that wound roll will succeed regardless of the strength and toughness. It's not a very common ability whatsoever in Warhammer 40k, outside of a few anti-things. Outside of stuff with enormous strength values, there's not very much in the game that just flatly wounds everything on a 3+. It means that while they might be paying a bit of a premium for their damage output, they should be just flatly, at least fairly effective against literally everything, and this keeps them far more relevant against things like tanks and monsters, which otherwise they wouldn't hit all that hard. For the downside though, if they don't kill any models during the fight phase, one model in the unit just gets flat out destroyed. Apparently Slaanesh isn't going to be very pleased if they achieve less than perfection. That's a downside with a very real risk given that they'll often want to activate that against tough stuff like monsters and vehicles. and particularly against things with invulnerable saves, or if you've got a depleted unit, you might have a very real chance of just not killing the thing, but you still want to wound on 3s to deal the damage, and then you might be losing a model that's essentially around about 43 points or so. Definitely a really interesting rule, though with quite a big downside. Next up, we'll take a quick look at their overall damage output, though before we do, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Snowman. They're a gaming store based in Montreal in Canada, active since 2019. They've got a whole load of collectible type things, but have been developing their Warhammer range recently, building it up and up. And one of the places where you can order things at 15% off Games Workshop prices. That's generally the best discount that stores are normally able to offer in the USA and Canada. They ship nationwide, generally combining postage at around about 15 Canadian dollars, sometimes less for smaller items. Here's the address of their physical store. And they also have their web store as well. Fairly easy to search and navigate for things, and if you want a Games Workshop item that they're not stocking at the moment, you can contact their sales email address for back orders, and they'll order in the exact item for you. For the Emperor's Children release, they're planning to stock a good amount of the Champions of Slaanesh box set, so it could be one option to pick that up in Canada if you were looking to get your hands on the new box set. At time of recording, we're still waiting for the release of it, so we'll see whether or not Games Workshop actually makes enough of them to satisfy demand. Hopefully they will do. In any case though, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video, and feel free to check them out, links down in the video description, if you were looking to pick up some discount 40k things in Canada. Getting back to it though, let's take a look at what these guys can do when they get into glorious close combat. For 3 of them, so around about 130 points, their rough damage output would be around about 6 slain termagants, 4 slain intercessors, with terminators maybe about 1 and potentially having 1 injured as well, around 8 wounds to a gladiator tank, or 7 wounds to a land raider. All of these certainly very ballpark figures of course, and they could certainly swing high or low. For these ones, they're using their auto wounds on 3s thing against the 2 tank targets, and if they are able to use that rule, they feel like they're notably good against the big tough stuff, and particularly the 2 wound infantry as well. For around 130 points worth of elite melee damage though, they don't feel like they're quite so standout against say the Terminators or the Horde target. I guess low attacks there, plus the difficulty of dealing with 4+ invulnerable saves doesn't help them. Just to visualise double the numbers, if you had a squad of 6 of them and they all got into fight, these are just those previous numbers but doubled up. Particularly against the vehicle targets, that makes a big difference. It feels like 6 of them would have a pretty good chance to one-shot most normal-sized battle tanks and have a fair crack at the Land Raider as well, even without other buffs, and maybe just reduce the likelihood that they're going to fall short and take a casualty due to their critical hits thing. This is 260 points worth of models though, so really quite a big investment, and at least some reasonable chance they charge into something, destroy something and then get hit back very very hard after that. Beyond the base datasheet though, let's talk about unit support. As their Emperor's Children, they can use their Thrill Seekers rule, and that's most important for advance and charge, so they do have a very big strike threat range, 8-inch movement plus d6-inch advances, plus an extra 2d6-inch charging, so their typical threat range is going to be around about 19-inch charge or so. That's pretty solid for on-foot infantry, and you could speed that up with a couple of things such as the Auto 6 advance from the Mercurial Host. But as infantry being able to walk straight through ruined walls and things, that should often mean they should be able to make charges from a position of safety. They can also fall back and charge something as well if it makes more sense. They just wouldn't be able to charge back in against the same targets due to the limitations of the rule. For other unit support for transports and characters, I'd say they don't really have quite so much going on versus the Noise Marines or the Infractors. For transports, they can't ride in Rhinos, so it will be a Land Raider or none. The problem with Land Raiders for them though is that with their Thrill Seeker special rule, the Land Raider kind of prevents you using that if you're using the Assault Ramp rule for it. With the usual thing that you want to do with a Land Raider, you'd move it up 10 inches, get the unit out 3 inches in front of it and then charge, so it's around about a 20-inch average threat range, which is quite nice. But as I mentioned with Thrill Seekers, you get more or less that already. It actually would make more sense to use the Land Raider as just a springboard to jump off in the movement phase. So get them out before the Land Raiders moved, and that basically just adds 3 inches to your threat range otherwise, so at 22 inches on average. It feels like it's more just an option than necessarily a good option, and I feel like most people won't be taking the 240 point premium and more tend to use them behind terrain and then just use their on the board good movement. I guess you'd be more tempted to make use of a Land Raider in the transport detachment perhaps, where you'd actually get a good damage buff along with that. Character-wise, they can only be joined by Lucius the Eternal, which maybe isn't the best news for them, given that he doesn't actually buff the squad at all. He just provides his own melee damage and can make use of their critical wounds rule, and that's maybe a touch unfortunate given that they can't use any enhancements. so none of the fancy things from the detachments can go in the squads, which is kind of a shame given that a fair few of them would be probably better on flawless blades than anywhere else. I certainly would have enjoyed the Lord Exaltant's lethal hits as well if he was able to join. I guess otherwise for character support, they could in theory benefit from the Demon Prince's melee AP buff that he has, and that could get them up to AP 4 if they're nearby a Demon Prince. But I feel like a lot of the time that's just not really going to be worth the coordination. AP3 tends to be adequate for the vast majority of targets out there. It's only be things like 2+ saves with Armour of Contempt that you'd really feel like you needed that. For Lucius the Eternal, he's listed at 140 points printed in Codex, and he basically has the option of being a lone operative or leading the Flawless Blades. If he was leading the unit, he'd add 6 attacks at Strength 8, AP 3 and Damage 3 with Precision, which definitely is interesting enough, particularly when buffed with his reroll or hit and wound rolls versus characters, monsters and walkers. He does add some pretty huge extra personal damage there, and the damage 3 is really good against things like Terminators, which as mentioned they maybe aren't as standout against as some. And it does mean that they'd hit a fair bit harder against tough tanks and vehicles they might be charging into. Like say for example he does 8 wounds to a gladiator tank even without his rerolls functioning. If the unit with him in gets into say an enemy character unit or an enemy walker or monster, he's going to absolutely blend them along with those critical hits on 3s. I feel like if you're taking 6 of them, there's a good chance he could be overkill though. As we saw by their damage output previously, they should have at least a reasonable chance of one-shotting a Land Raider, particularly if they get something like sustained hits from the Peerless Bladesman detachment. If you went for a big 400 point odd unit, then they're probably going to be at the point where they're killing things like Imperial Knights in a turn, but that might not be necessarily all the most helpful or needed. If say they have to go into something far less valuable and then the squad just gets wiped out in retaliation. I guess it could be an option to weigh up between whether or not you expand to a squad of 6 for a unit of 3 of them, or if you take just 3 with Lucius. He's kind of similar to adding an extra 3 flawless blades, both in terms of damage and defense really. Plus he might be a bit more annoying when he winds up having the rest of his bodyguard killed and he gets to be a lone operative again. Though I feel like my first instincts are probably that he's just more handy just running around as a lone operative by himself anyway, as that does feel like quite a lot of extra value. You basically have to weigh up between lone operative and fights first rules being active for him, or being paired with the flawless blades and basically getting the damage buff with the auto wound everything on 3s for criticals. Detachment wise, most of them at least have something for melee. Maybe a few of them feel a bit more relevant than others though. Slaanesh's Chosen might not be all that relevant to too many of them, given that it revolves around Lucius being in the unit, otherwise they wouldn't have any other buffs without having the character keyword. The Coterie of the Conceited is the one where you get the progressive damage buffs as you get more kill points. If that can get rolling fast enough, then there's certainly some big potential there. Rerolling ones to hit and wounds would be quite a big deal to them. That'd be a 36% damage boost overall, and then their damage would just go to absolute rage mode by the time that they got to number 5 or higher. Lethal and sustained hits on top of that would just be massive. There's a few stratagems there that could help them out for damage or defense. Maybe the Feel No Pain one could be nice if they're hit by damage 3 weapons, and maybe they could be a good choice to force the enemy to hit a unit that isn't them via a stratagem for melee. The Mercurial Host is the speed related one. They can reroll advances in that one for better threat range and have the automatic 6-inch advanced stratagem. That'll push them up to more like a 21-inch sort of threat range on average. There's a sustained hit stratagem that could be handy enough as well. Probably the single most obvious one for them though is the Peerless Bladesman. That gets them either sustained or lethal hits on the charge. If you're going with the critical hits on a 3+ one, then that'd basically mean that you always want the sustained hits as opposed to lethal hits. I guess lethal could be alright though if you really couldn't afford to activate that for fear of destroying the unit. On top of that, they've got a stratagem for an extra pip of AP. AP -4 swords could be pretty nice against things with high armor saves or armor of contempt equivalents, and they've got lots of good melee support there, boosted consolidation, charging a falling back unit and keeping them in melee, a fights on death one, and a -1 to hit in melee, quite a lot of stuff that they could reliably use. The Carnival of Excess is the demon one. That one gets you sustained hits if you're nearby demons, so again a nice easy damage buff if you can keep them coordinated with something otherworldly. And then the Rapid Evisceration is the transport one. If you're charging out of a Land Raider, that could give you reroll ones to hit and wound. I guess that would make a Land Raider more significant, and perhaps you could use some of the fancy combos to have them re-embark again. I feel like being locked to Land Raiders over Rhinos does mean that you're going to be paying a lot more for the privilege though, and the overall combo might be something like 500 points between 260 points worth of Flawless Blades plus the transport itself. Finally, just for one quick look at their augmented damage, here's the damage output for 6 of them, saying Peerless Bladesman on the charge. That's perhaps the most reliably easy one to activate the damage output for. But plenty of others could have something equivalent, like the Demons one, charging out of a transport, or activating the reroll once to hit at least for the Coterie of the Conceited. Adding sustained hits onto the fairly considerable damage of 6 of them really makes them hit incredibly hard though. For a rough average, it's around about 15 slain termagants, 10 intercessors, 3 or 4 terminators, around about 19 wounds to a toughness 10 tank, so that should be getting on for threatening to kill knight stat line units there, or 16 wounds to a land raider. That'd go up to 20 wounds if you use the extra AP stratagem that they can access there as well. Feels like units like that should be able to threaten to kill most single one units there, maybe having a bit more trouble if there's good invulnerable saves on the go. Maybe the challenge will be getting them into something that's meaningful enough with loads of points that you can really tear out the heart of the enemy army, as they will get hit back hard. Overall, they certainly feel like one of the more interesting units for the Emperor's Children. They seem like a strong option for destroying tanks, vehicles, and certain medium infantry. It feels like for their competitors, for the melee damage thing, a Lord Exultant with the Infractors can also hit seriously massively hard as well, particularly on the middle objectives. And for other anti-tank style options, I guess there's Fulgrim himself, the Mauler Fiend, and maybe allied War Dogs of one sort or another. For their main positives, they're infantry that have got really quite a long threat range, with 8-inch movement and thrill seekers to get them towards their prey, and then very solid general purpose damage output at base without having to use any buffs on them if you don't want to, and particularly so in Peerless Bladesmen. They're going to be best against things without invulnerable saves or 2-wound infantry. For the downsides, their best damage rule also having the very real possibility of inflicting self-casualties if they engage something that's a single big tanky individual model could be kind of bad. It feels like you wouldn't be able to get maximal damage output out of small depleted squads of them, or at least not without a big risk of losing another 40 odd point model. I think you would have to think about their targets and whether or not you can justify the risk of that rule. It is a shame not to be able to get enhancements into the unit, and Lucius to me feels stronger as a lone operative as opposed to leading these guys, even if you could have a monumentally dangerous unit if he was with them. Their durability for the points really isn't great at all. If they get hit back by the enemy and exposed, most things in the game should be at least fairly efficient against them, and any damage 3 weapons could be taking them down very quickly. And while their damage output's nice and general purpose, they might be a bit weaker against things with good invulnerable saves or 1-wound infantry, both kind of suboptimal targets for them really. Overall though, they certainly look interesting, final points depending, seem nice as a unit that could likely get the jump on the foe with a bunch of hurt on them, and have good damage output against pretty much everything. I think I might be a bit more tempted to use them in 6s rather than 3s, just due to being able to wipe out the unit without taking self-casualties. And I feel like maybe having a balance between these and Infractors led by Lord Exultants could be interesting for the melee threats, and maybe throw Fulgrim in there as well. In any case, let me know what you think of the unit. I look forward to hearing your takes down in the comments below. As mentioned, a big thank you to Toy Snowman for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description. If you're looking to pick up some Warhammer in Canada and want 15% off the prices, they should hopefully be getting a good number of the Champions of Slaanesh box sets if you want to check them out for that. Hopefully Games Workshop will have supplied enough of them. In any case, I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly be keeping the regular videos coming. I'll have a few more coming for the Emperor's Children over the next few days, hopefully. Check out the Patreon page, link down in the video description if you'd like to help support the channel. That's the main thing that supports the video creation and keeps the videos coming, and there's a few other things on there such as entry to the regular giveaways and seeing certain videos early from time to time. In any case though, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.